Hi there, welcome to BoomerTube's podcast, the place for baby boomers to come play with your own age group. I'm Deb, and I'm your host. Before we get into today's show, I want to make sure to let you know that we would love to make your story a part of our podcast. So please visit our website for info on how to submit stories or music. If you have a unique, funny, or poignant anecdote about growing up, your teenage years, music, cars, dating, your parents, anything you think our listeners might enjoy, send it to us. We're boomers, and most of us were raised by the greatest generation, an exceptional group of people who deserve our enduring respect. And with that, here we go. The Vietnam War was the largest deployment of military working dogs in U.S. military history. While official records weren't maintained in the early days of the war, estimates suggest nearly 5,000 canines were deployed across all four branches of the U.S. military, with 10,000 total handlers. While the First and Second World Wars established and refined military canine programs, the Vietnam War saw an advancement in training techniques and increased effectiveness in canine detection, scouting, sentry, and tracking capabilities. Dogs have been man's partners in war for a long time, at least as far back as 4000 BC. Their keen senses, learning ability, physical endurance, and devotion to man have made them invaluable companions on battlefields, both past and present. The jungles of Vietnam created a challenging scenario for U.S. military forces. In most cases, the enemy had an advantage through superior knowledge of the landscape and the element of surprise. Canines were the number one tool to help American soldiers get the upper hand, though. Their superior sense of smell and hearing made canines absolutely vital in sentry and tracking duties. According to the Defense Department, canines raised the IED detection rate on patrols from 50 to 80%, which saved countless lives. During patrols, canine handler teams were often assigned to walk point, out in front of the rest of their unit. These canine teams scouted the jungle for Viet Cong ambushes and were often able to alert the rest of the unit to enemies well before they fell into a potential trap set for them in the jungle. From there, the unit could call in an airstrike on the enemy position. When the war ended, many handlers wanted to bring their dogs home to America. In a decision that remains controversial to this day, the Department of Defense classified the dogs as equipment, and most were left behind, transferred to the Army of South Vietnam, systematically euthanized, or simply abandoned. This unfitting end motivated Vietnam dog handlers to act. Due in large part to their collective efforts, Robbie's Law was passed in the U.S. Congress in 2000. Since then, no adoptable dogs are euthanized at the end of their military service. Instead, they're offered first to former military dog handlers, then to law enforcement, and finally to qualified families who undergo a rigorous screening process. We have a good friend in Colorado. His name is Gary Weigel. We've known Gary for about 25 years now, and until recently, I was unaware of his history as a dog handler during the Vietnam War. That sounded like an interesting story to tell, so of course, I began to bug Gary for details. Here is his story. When Gary finished basic training with the Air Force in 1966, he expressed an interest in the field of electronics. But, as he soon learned, the Air Force needs come first, so he was sent to security police training. Gary's first assignment was as base security at Naha Air Base in Okinawa. After a week or so of base orientation and job assignments, a guy across the hall from Gary asked him if he would be interested in becoming a dog handler, as they were short one handler, with a few others rotating out in a few months. Gary interviewed with the tech sergeant who was in charge, and within a couple of days, he was assigned to the canine section and met his first dog named Happy from San Juan Capistrano. Within the canine units were new dogs and more experienced dogs. The more experienced dogs had been through basic and advanced training and had already had a handler or two previously assigned to them. When previous handlers were rotated out and the dog had been in his or her kennel for a few days, they were more than ready to get out and run around and get back to what he or she had been trained to do. On Gary's first day as a handler, his sergeant took him out to the kennel and said, "Gary, this is Happy. Happy, this is Gary. Here's her equipment, collar, leash, muzzle, and grooming brushes. You have a couple of hours to get acquainted, then get her out into the training area. First, give her some fresh water, sit down next to the kennel and just talk to her. Then, when you think the time is right, rattle the choke chain and see if she responds in a positive manner." "What's a positive manner? How should I know? I've never had a dog before," Gary thought. "Just open up the kennel, walk in, put the chain around her neck, clip on the leash, and take her out for a walk." Well, Gary and Happy seemed to hit it off, so off to the training area they went. Other handlers were there to instruct him on grooming, routine, and off-leash training, running the obstacle course, and later on the attack training and sessions at the firing range. The dogs had already been trained in both verbal and hand signals such as sit, down, stay, come, and heel, so now it was necessary to keep them physically fit and mentally alert. Every day was a training day, even if they didn't have post-duty that evening. After the dogs mastered the obstacle course, it was time to work on the fun stuff, which was letting the dog go and encouraging him or her to bite someone. For this exercise, they used the full padded suit and arm sleeve. Additional attack training involved having the dog muzzled and letting him or her go after the subject. Gary indicates this part was a bit dicey. They also went to outlying areas on the base where they would have a couple of guys hide, and they would ask the dogs to search them out. Gary's buddy Glenn, who Gary had recommended for canine duty, was assigned to Laddie, a very aggressive black German shepherd. Laddie's handler had returned stateside for about a week when Glenn was assigned to him. During the next week, Glenn brought Laddie water, his food, and read poetry to the dog for hours. Laddie stood in the shelter portion of his kennel and growled at Glenn for hours. Finally, on day 10 of this ritual, Glenn made the decision to take control, walked into the kennel to start his training. 5 minutes later, Glenn walked into the canine office, bleeding from numerous dog bites on his hand and arm and requesting medical assistance. Another 3 or 4 days passed, and Glenn finally decided he wasn't going to play Mr. Nice Guy any longer. He stood in front of the kennel and, in a stern voice, commanded Laddie to sit. He opened the kennel gate, put the chain around Laddie's neck, and off to the training area they went as best buddies. Gary and others told Glenn it must have been all that poetry that ticked Laddie off. After 18 months in Okinawa, Gary put in for Germany, but instead was sent to Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana from January to April. To quote Gary, "You have no idea how cold it can be until you have all your socks you have on, with winter gear on top of that, a wool cap, 2 pairs of wool socks, and bunny boots. Putting on all the necessary gear just to survive the very cold weather made it impossible to get any weapon, with the exception of just letting your dog go if the situation arose. The dogs loved the cold weather a lot more than the handlers did. Sometimes they just couldn't put on enough clothing. Zzz, brr. They were short on dog handlers at Malmstrom, so Gary worked with 2 dogs, Ingo and Alex. They had training every day, along with guard duty, in a huge missile storage facility. They started when the sun went down and came off duty when the sun came up. Gary doesn't remember many days off and didn't even know where the Airmen's Club was. He only knew where the chow hall, his quarters, the canine compound, and the missile storage areas were located. But it was never too cold for training or guard duty. Outside, of course. After 90 days at Malmstrom, Gary got his orders for Vietnam. Gary and his buddy Ron were both assigned to the canine section of the 31st SPS at Tuy Hoa Air Base in Vietnam, where more handlers and dogs were needed. Gary's first dog assignment was Duchess. But after 30 days in Vietnam, Gary and Ron were given temporary orders to train additional dogs for 45 days at Showa Air Station, near Tachikawa Air Base just outside of Tachikawa, Japan. The center had over 30 dogs. In Japan, Gary and Ron were each assigned 2 dogs. One they would take back with them to their base, and the others to be dropped off in Da Nang on their way back to Tuihua. Those dogs didn't have any training. In a few cases, some had obedience training by their previous owners, but nothing like what their new duties would be from that point on. Training began at 0700 hours and went until after dark, 6 days a week. Grooming, on-leash training, sit, down, stay, come, heel, then the obstacle course. This was the extent of the training for the dogs to be dropped off in Da Nang, because the handlers didn't know what they were going to be used for. If these dogs were to be used for scouting or tracking, they could be in close proximity to other troops, so they received basic on-off leash commands and search for the enemy training, while the guys would hide in tall grass and the dogs used his senses to find the individual. The dogs going back with Gary and Ron were to be sentry dogs. Different training. With these dogs, any perpetrator was either going to be shot or the dog would have a new chew toy, and that meant attack training. The first 2 dogs assigned were Duke with Ron Sweet and Odin with Gary. These 2 dogs received all the training for security work, which consisted of basic on and off leash commands, search for the enemy, and attack training. This is where the dog's training process became much more intense. The unmuzzled training is what you usually see in a demonstration. The dog attacks a guy in a heavily padded suit. They get used to seeing the suit and they know it's time to attack. So what happens if a trainer is not wearing a padded suit? That's why they do the muzzled attack training. When you signal to the dog that this is a bad guy, he knows it's time to attack. To quote Gary, "I can tell you, it's a frightening experience to be the bad guy when that dog hits you in the chest and you go down, and he's standing on top of you trying to get his muzzle off." These dogs are all business. In addition to their respective training regimens, the dog received exposure to gunfire at the rifle range. Grooming and care was important. They had a veterinarian, but when it came to the dog's teeth, they went to the same dental and medical clinic that was for all the servicemen and their families. The handlers would give the dogs a sedative and carry them through the waiting room where people were seated. I loved that. While all this training was going on, the trainers were constantly evaluating the dogs and looking for any hesitancy in performing their tasks and determining if the dogs really liked their job. After 2 days of final evaluation and testing, it was time to start the dog's actual duty. The last question from the instructor to the handler was, "Do you feel confident with this dog and his abilities? You're staking your life on it." Gary's answer was yes. The following morning, they prepped the dogs for travel and headed to the flight line to board the Tiger Airlines transport back to Da Nang via Clark Air Base in the Philippines to drop off 2 of the 4 dogs. There was a bit of a delay, however, due to their navigator being drunk from partying the night before, so they had to wait for him to be carried onto the plane. They boarded the plane with the hope that their pilot could find Clark Air Base. They reached Clark at midnight with 100-degree temperature on the ground. The security police picked up their dogs and took Gary, Ron, and their 2 dogs to a hangar for some chow and sleep before continuing on to Da Nang. When Gary returned, he learned that Duchess had been reassigned to another handler, and Odin was now his new dog. Air Force personnel were responsible for regular police duties on the base, points of entry to the flight line where all the planes were located, and inside the perimeter fencing on the roads inside the base. The K-9 section consisted of both Air Force personnel and civilian guards. There were only 6 Air Force personnel and about 20-plus civilian guards who were dog handlers. The Navy had a facility on the island, and the interior of the compound was guarded by Marines. The Air Force had bunkers on the island that were full of aircraft weapons. They covered the entire island on foot with 1 dog, all the way around the island to the back gate, where Marines would challenge them several times a night when they came too close to the naval compound. One assignment involved an incident at the Airmen's Club. A disagreement took place over the type of music being played, which resulted in a riot and demonstration. Management called Gary and another off-duty dog handler to clear the place out. Amazing how fast 2 dog handlers cleared the place, going in fully armed with 2 unmuzzled dogs ready to bite somebody. Nine months passed, with Gary and Odin becoming close buddies. They not only did base perimeter security, but also went on search and destroy missions with the U.S. Army and ARVN troops. That's Army of the Republic of Vietnam. They enjoyed full moon nights and breezes that came off the ocean, along with endless nights of rain under a leaky poncho that dated back to the Korean War. There were nights when Navy battleships lit up the horizon and launched shells 15 miles in from the coast. They listened to random rifle fire and mortar rounds coming in from the neighboring village just outside the perimeter, and watched C-47 gunships fire tracer rounds into the nearby mountains. They sat at the end of the runway as C-130s brought in supplies and took off with endless numbers of wounded and dead servicemen. They endured a night of chaos when a sniper squad infiltrated the perimeter and blew up some F-100s and C-130s. There were 8 Viet Cong killed on base, 2 in the perimeter wire, and 1 found outside. They took a boat ride to the island of Lashima, where war correspondent Ernie Pyle was killed during World War II. There were some good memories, too. They attended a Shinto wedding of one of their civilian guards and were in an extended family photo, which Gary considered to be a great honor. Gary says, "You have no idea how much faith you put in this companion when you're out in the post with just you and the dog, whether it's a beautiful night or during a pouring rainstorm. Thanks, Odin. You served me well and are never to be forgotten for your service." On Gary's last day, he saved a piece of cake from the celebration the night before and walked to Odin's kennel. Odin and Gary ate from the same piece of cake. Gary kissed him, and Odin's tongue spread cake across Gary's face as he kissed him back. Gary gave him a big hug, thanked him for his service, and walked away. Gary was a military dogman from 1966 to 69. After he left Vietnam in the service, he returned to the U.S. and married his sweetheart, Clarine. In 2017, Gary received a call from his old buddy, Ron Sweet, in Wisconsin, regarding the High Grounds Veterans Memorial Park and a War Dog Memorial Monument that was to be dedicated in June of the following year. Ron wanted to know if Gary would like to have Odin's and Gary's name inscribed into the memorial. Gary responded with absolutely, and he and Clarine made the trip to Wisconsin to take part in what was a very memorable event. Since that first inscription, they have added another Vietnam buddy of theirs, Mike Brown from Meade, Kansas, to the monument, with plans to add 2 more, Joe Guerrero from White Salmon, Washington, and Bradley Kais from Atlanta, Georgia. A special acknowledgement to some of the guys Gary mentioned from his team include Ron Simmons, Glenn Olson from Manteca, California, Dave Monroe from Minnesota, Ron Sweet from Wisconsin, George Esqueda from California, and Talmadge and Tim Lane, brothers from Ashland, Kentucky. 4-legged team members include Happy, Laddie, Shane, Duchess, Ingo, Alex, Nikki, Duke, and of course, Odin. We've included a link in our show notes to the memorial where Gary, Odin, and his other 2- and 4-legged companions are remembered. Go to Vietnam Dog Handlers Association website. That link is www.vdha.us/memorials and choose the High Grounds Memorial in Wisconsin to read Gary's post and see his photos from the dedication. We would also like to encourage you to consider adopting a retired military or police dog. There are numerous agencies around the country to assist with the process, and you won't find a better trained or more loyal companion than one of these canine heroes. Our thanks to Gary for sharing his experiences with us, along with our sincere thanks to him for his service and dedication to our country. If you've listened to our previous podcast, you know we like to showcase original music written and performed by our listeners. We play this episode's song here, then post it at BoomerTube where you can download it. The name of the artist and their contact information is posted there as well. This week, we welcome back Rob Scholes to the show. Rob is a singer-songwriter from Eagle, Idaho. He used to describe himself as an unrepentant middle-aged stage junkie, but Rob now says that the middle-aged part has left the building. Rob started playing guitar and writing songs when he was 18 because he thought it would be a good way to meet chicks. Spoiler alert, he adds it worked. He then headlined his living room for the next 15 years. Rob got pulled, kicking and screaming, out onto a stage with his band Danskin Station in the late 80s, and the early 90s found him in a 3-piece folk rock trio called River, playing the Boise River Festival, State Fair, local festivals, bars, weddings, and funerals. The band broke up in 93, and Rob played solo for the next 7 years. In 2000, Rob and a friend formed the world-famous, are you ready for it? Hot Spittin' Llamas. And they again played various local venues and performed during a radio show with Joe Pren. Rob describes their type of music as folk and rock a country beergrass. Not sure Nashville's heard of that one yet. Rob says music has introduced him to people, places, and situations that would have never happened otherwise. He says music still takes him places like the shotgun seat of an old Ford pickup on a warm summer night, when times were simpler. Rob continues to write and perform intriguing music filled with wickedly clever lyrics, and recently headlined a showcase of performers at the Ironwood Bar and Grill in Boise. A special note regarding today's song. Not Forgotten Men was written by Tim and me, as a tribute to all those who have served our country, now and in the past. Tim wrote half the song about 30 years ago, and I always loved it, so several months ago we started working on lyrics to finish it. Normally, Tim would have performed the song, but since we're currently without anything closely resembling a proper recording studio, we enlisted Rob's help to bring this song to life and share it with the world. Here is Not Forgotten Men.
I came from Colorado. I was leaning against the wall, looking for a name long gone, someone long ago. And I was dug in deep head first, searching for my friends. This voice came ringing out, this is what they said. If you see our brothers coming, won't you tell them that we're here? Tell them not to be afraid, not to shed a tear. For they'll see our souls are running, running with the wind. And as long as you remember, we are not forgotten men. We were just 18, gung-ho as hell. First stop at a boot camp was a tour in Vietnam. Ain't nobody tougher when you know you are the best. But after 13 months in country, we know we're like the rest. And if you see our brothers coming, won't you tell them that we're here? Tell them not to be afraid, not to shed a tear. For they'll see our souls are running, running with the wind. And as long as you remember, we are not forgotten men. Well, at 20,000 feet, your hands are cold as ice. Flak explodes around you as you're ready for the fight. Check the ammo on the 50s, no time to feel the fear. Thoughts of loved ones come to haunt, remind you why you're here. For every veteran has a fire in their eye, a fire that burns white hot when duty calls. Remember them, their willingness to die, the oath they took and pledged to give their all. Well, now we're 1,000 miles from nowhere, doing what we do. There's dancing with the devil, we're all bound to see it through. And we think about our fallen when we look up at the stars. We're bound by love of country, we are all brothers in arms. When you see your brothers coming, won't you tell them that we're here? Tell them not to be afraid, tell them not to shed a tear, for they'll see our souls are running, running with the wind. And as long as you remember, we are not forgotten men. Oh, as long as you remember, we are not forgotten men.
You just heard Not Forgotten Men. A big thank you once again to Rob for helping us with this one. Great job, sir. We love to hear and play original music, so if you're listening and you're an artist, I hope this inspires you to send us yours. We like to keep it classic like rock, country, or the blues, but if you've got a tune representing another genre or an instrumental, we would love to hear it. You'll find guidelines for submitting music to us at BoomerTube.com. Please make it a recording with a group or an instrument. Put on your best voice and let us help you showcase your work, because you never know who might be listening. And as we mentioned at the top of the program, we would love to make your story a part of our podcast. I'd love to hear from you. If you've enjoyed our podcast, it would mean a lot to us if you would share it with your friends and family. Once again, the website is BoomerTube.com, and you can email me at deb@BoomerTube.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time, come play with your own age group. Deb out.